Learning Objective 4 talks about our final set of variances, and these are our variances for manufacturing overhead. Now, I want you guys to understand the concept behind manufacturing overhead variances, but I'm not truly as concerned about you completing calculations here. We have more liberty as managers to control direct labor and material than we do manufacturing overhead, but I do want you to understand the concepts behind it. So just bear with me as we move through this brief presentation about overhead. So we're going to look at the difference between what we actually spent on overhead and the standard keyword here. Let me grab my pen, and a comparison of, let's do that again, the amount that we actually allocated to production. Okay, there is a difference. So let's look through these slides to see what that is. If we remember, we allocate overhead to production based on some standard overhead allocation rate. Okay, and how did we come up with this allocation rate? Remember, we had estimated overhead and we identified some type of driver, machine hours, labor dollars. So estimated overhead divided by an estimated driver gives us this allocation rate. And as we are moving through production, we simply use this allocation rate times whatever our base or driver happens to be for what we are actually producing. Okay, hold on. We'll see this come through more clearly in some of these following slides. So if we're looking at variable overhead, we need some of the following information. What is our, especially here, we'll break it down into variable and fixed. So in variable overhead, we're looking at what is our standard. We had estimated that we would spend $3 in overhead for every direct labor hour that was worked. We had also estimated for overhead that our driver was direct labor hours, and we've estimated that those hours are going to be 0.25 or a quarter of an hour for every batch of crayons we produce. So we know what the variable standards were, what were our actual amounts. So we know the actual direct labor hours, this is our driver, and we know the actual cost that we spent on variable overhead. So this is our variable overhead rate. On the next screen, we're going to calculate what our actual overhead rate ended up being, which is simply, as we saw before, I spent $30,160 on overhead. If I divide that by the 10,400 direct labor hours, we will see this move forward to the 290. This is the actual cost that we spent per direct labor hour on overhead compared to the $3 that we thought we were going to spend. So immediately what we see is a favorable variance because I thought I would spend $3 for every direct labor and overhead, and we only spent $2.90. It's a 10-cent difference. That's not too bad. That's a very close estimate for us. And we multiply that times the number of direct labor hours that we actually worked, and that's the difference. This is our variance, a $1,040 favorable variance. So we actually spent less than expected here. Now, this is our cost variance. What about efficiency? Okay, so remember that we actually worked 10,400 direct labor hours. That is what's driving overhead. That's why this is important. But remember, for the 52,000 batches of crayons that we actually manufactured, we estimated that they would take 13,000 direct labor hours for the 52,000 batches. So I thought I was going to be using 13,000 hours. That's what I used to come up with my estimates, but I only worked 10,400. So if I'm allocating overhead based on direct labor hours, my direct labor hours are less than what I thought they should be. So I have a favorable variable overhead efficiency variance. Okay, so once again, we've got two favorable variances, the cost variance and the efficiency variance, so an $8,840 favorable variance. So the question that I would expect to hold you guys accountable for here is, what do we do with this? It's favorable. So do I just keep my overhead rate as it is? Remember our standard overhead rate was $3 per direct labor hour. Well, is that correct, or do I really need to reassess and reduce it to $2.90? On the other hand, we had also estimated that we should take 13,000 hours to manufacture these crayons, and it only took 10,400. So next year, do we need to reconsider, if operations are exactly the same next year as this year, do we need to reconsider whether I need to adjust my variable overhead rate, and do I need to adjust my driver, which I am using these drivers to predict what I think this rate is going to be? Okay, so variable overhead we do have some control over. Unfortunately, when we get to fixed overhead, there's very little that we can do about these variances. They are what they are, and they only differ because we produce more or less than what we thought we were going to produce. But what I will hold you guys accountable for, I do want you to understand there are three terms that you've got to be familiar with here: actual overhead, budgeted overhead, allocated overhead, and they are different. Okay, actual is what we actually spent on overhead. So if we get to the end of the period, how much did I actually spend on maintenance, depreciation, indirect labor, indirect materials? Budgeted, on the other hand, is when we were coming up with our flexible budget or our static budget, our master budget, how much did we estimate our total overhead was going to be? This is our budgeted amount. And if you'll remember, we're using this budgeted overhead amount divided by some driver or base, okay, to come up with an estimated overhead application rate. Okay, so I know this is kind of crazy. This is my overhead application rate. So this is the $3 that we had estimated before. So careful here. I've got what I actually spent on overhead, and I have what I budgeted. Budgeted overhead divided by my budgeted driver gives me my overhead application rate, and I use my overhead application rate to allocate overhead to my products. Okay, so these are three different terms, and you need to understand the difference in them. So when we're calculating our cost variance, it's simply the difference between what did I actually spend on overhead and what did I budget. Okay, probably the most basic, the easiest to calculate. I actually spent $23,920. I budgeted $25,000. Okay, and this is just, there's really not anything here that impacts this change other than it was just not a correct estimate. But we want it to be as close as it can possibly be, and this is probably an immaterial difference. That's okay. Now, on the volume variance, okay, a little bit of a different scenario. Okay, your book tells you there's a difference between how volume and the cost variance is actually determined here. The volume variance, remember, cost is the difference between actual and budget. Volume is the difference between budget and allocated. All right, so there is a difference. And budgeted, we said, is simply, what did we estimate? We estimated $25,000 for budgeted overhead. But how much did I allocate? Well, remember, we had estimated that our overhead allocation rate should be $2 per direct labor hour using this formula here. Budgeted fixed overhead divided by some type of driver gives me my overhead application rate of $2 per direct labor hour. All right, so this is my standard. And I am going to multiply that. If $2 was my standard, and if you'll remember, we had originally said that we estimated our driver to be a quarter of an hour per batch. I'm going to manufacture 52,000 batches. So my estimate of 25 direct labor hours per batch. These direct labor hours are what's driving my overhead. So if it's $2 per direct labor hour, 0.25 hours for 52,000 batches means I incurred 13,000 direct labor hours this year. So as I incurred those direct labor hours to manufacture 52,000 batches, I was allocating overhead at a rate of $2 per direct labor hour. So I allocated $26,000 worth of overhead. Okay, I budgeted 25, I allocated 26. And why did I allocate more than what I budgeted? Because I manufactured more than I budgeted for. Okay, and that's why we call it the volume variance. That's the only thing that causes us to have a favorable or an unfavorable variance, is whether I manufacture more or less than what I actually estimated in my initial budgets. So we can see in the summary of overhead, we have our favorable cost variance, we have our favorable volume variance. This one we have very little control over. As volume changes, we will have fixed overhead volume variances, but it's just because we produce more or less than what we thought. Now, the cost variance, on the other hand, there's a little bit we could do or analyze here, because this is, if we'll back up to that cost overhead variance, what did I actually spend on overhead compared to what I budgeted? Did I have more depreciation than I thought? Did I have more supervisor salary? Did I have more indirect materials? Did I have more maintenance? Okay, these are things we can't necessarily predict 100% accurately every year, and so we simply have to discern when this is an overhead, when this overhead variance is something that we can live with, or when we need to go back and reconsider whether our overhead application rate, our estimated overhead, and our estimated drivers are accurate, or whether we need to realign those in future periods. Okay, so, and it can be different for different organizations, but you have to have some standard or floor that you're willing to accept for your overhead variance, and then and be able to identify when you need to make some changes into your allocation rates. Okay, I know that's confusing. Once again, I'm not as concerned about your calculations here as you understand the difference between the variable overhead variance, the fixed overhead variance, and the different terminology that comes along with it. Okay, we've got a couple of other objectives left, and we will see those in the next few videos as we wrap up this chapter.